What I'm about to share with you isn't something I talk about often. For a long time, I couldn't even think about it without feeling my chest tighten and my hands start to shake. But I've come to realize that keeping silent about experiences like this does more harm than good. If my story can make even one person more cautious, more aware of what's possible in isolated wilderness areas, then it's worth reliving the worst 3 days of my life. Because the truth is, we like to think that nature is the biggest danger out there. But sometimes, the most dangerous predator in the woods walks on 2 legs. This happened in the fall of 2017. I was planning a solo backpacking trip through a section of the Superior hiking trail in northern Minnesota, right along the shore of Lake Superior. I'd been going through a divorce, and honestly, I just needed to clear my head. I needed space from everything and everyone. The trail was supposed to be moderately trafficked that time of year, with the fall colors bringing in tourists and photographers. But I deliberately chose a less popular section, one that branched off into some old, logging roads that had been reclaimed by the forest decades ago. I'd done plenty of solo trips before. Yellowstone, the Rockies, parts of the Continental Divide. I wasn't some weekend warrior who thought watching survival shows made me prepared. I had a satellite phone, a first aid kit that could handle serious injuries, water purification tablets, bear spray, and yes, a firearm. I'm not going to get into the debate about guns in the wilderness, but I will say this. After what happened, I'm glad I had it. The first 2 days were exactly what I needed. The weather was crisp, but not cold. The leaves were peak color, and I saw maybe 3 other hikers the entire time. By the 3rd morning, I'd reached the junction where the maintained trail met the old logging road. There was a faded wooden sign that read, "Trail Not," maintained beyond this point, with a smaller note underneath warning about potential hazards and recommending experienced hikers only. I stood there for probably 10 minutes, debating. The maintained trail looped back toward the trailhead, and I could be back at my car by late afternoon. The logging road continued deeper into the forest, eventually connecting with another trail system about 15 miles away. It would add 2 days to my trip, but I had the supplies. And honestly, I wasn't ready to go back to my empty apartment and start dealing with lawyers and Division of Assets. So I took the old road. For the first few hours, it was beautiful in a haunting kind of way. The road was barely visible in places, completely swallowed by undergrowth and fallen trees. I had to navigate by compass and GPS more than once. But there was something magical about being that deep in the wilderness, knowing that probably no one had walked that exact path in months, maybe years. Around 4 in the afternoon, I found what looked like an old hunter's camp, just some rotted wood that might have been a lean-to at some point, a rusted coffee can, the remains of a fire pit. I was taking photos when I noticed something odd. Fresh boot prints in the soft earth near the fire pit. They were recent, maybe a day old at most. The tread was clear and distinct. I'm not going to lie, it unnerved me. But it also made sense. Hunting season was coming up, and people scout locations. Probably just someone checking out old camps, seeing if they were worth renovating. Still, I decided to push on another mile before setting up for the night. I wanted distance between me and whoever had been there. Found a good spot on a small rise with clear sightlines in most directions. I set up camp, filtered some water from a nearby stream, and made dinner as the sun started to set. I was just finishing up, starting to relax for the first time all day, when I heard it. Footsteps, not animal footsteps, human footsteps, crunching through leaves. They were close, maybe 50 yards out, moving parallel to my position. I called out, "Hello? Someone there?" Nothing. The footsteps stopped immediately. Complete silence. I stood up, hand moving to my bear spray. "I know you're out there. I can hear you." More silence. Then the footsteps again, but this time moving away, getting fainter until I couldn't hear them anymore. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound made me jump. Every branch crack, every animal movement. I was convinced it was someone circling my camp. When dawn finally came, I was exhausted but also angry. I was letting some random person, probably just another hiker who didn't want to interact, completely ruin my trip. I decided to pack up and keep moving. I'd push hard and try to reach the next trail. Junction by evening. I'd been hiking for maybe 2 hours when I found the first marker. It was a small cairn, a stack of rocks, sitting right in the middle of the old logging road. Nothing weird about that. People build cairns to mark trails all the time. Except this one had something on top. A small rusted hunting knife, blade down, stabbed into the top rock. My blood went cold. That wasn't a trail marker. That was a message. I pulled out my satellite phone to call for help, but I was in a dead zone. The terrain was too hilly, too much tree cover. I'd need to get to higher ground. I picked up my pace, checking behind me constantly. About 30 minutes later, I found the second cairn. This one had a different knife. And 20 minutes after that, a third cairn. Each one with a knife on top, each knife different. Someone was following me. Someone was marking my path. And they had been doing this for a while because those knives were old, rusted. These cairns weren't built yesterday. I started running. Not a full sprint, because I couldn't sustain that with my pack, but a steady jog. I had to get to high ground, had to get a signal. Behind me, I heard something that made my stomach drop. Whistling. Someone was whistling a tune I didn't recognize, high and clear, coming from somewhere back on the trail. That's when I knew. This wasn't random. This wasn't just some weird hiker. Someone was hunting me. Actually hunting me, like an animal. I don't know if they'd been tracking me since the maintained trail, or if they'd spotted me at the old camp, or if this was something they did to everyone who came down this path. But I knew with absolute certainty that I was in serious danger. I ran for another hour until my legs were screaming. I finally had to stop to catch my breath. I was bent over, hands on my knees, when I saw it. Stretched across the trail at shin height, a thin cord. A tripwire. I followed it with my eyes and saw it was connected to a bent sapling, loaded with tension. Attached to the sapling was a crude board studded with nails, positioned to swing right at chest height if the wire was tripped. I carefully stepped over it and kept moving. But now I was scanning every inch of ground in front of me. How many of these had I already passed without seeing them? How lucky had I been? The whistling started again, closer this time. I could hear footsteps, moving faster than before. Whoever it was, they knew I'd found the trap. They were done playing. I pulled out my firearm and fired twice into the air. The footsteps stopped immediately. I'm armed. I shouted, "I will shoot you if you come any closer." Silence. Then, from somewhere in the trees, a voice. Calm, almost amused. "You've got maybe 6 rounds in that thing. How many you willing to waste on warning shots?" I didn't respond. I just started moving again, faster now, abandoning any attempt at stealth. I crashed through undergrowth, jumped over logs, didn't care about the noise I was making. I just needed to get to higher ground. The whistling started again, but this time from a different direction. He was flanking me, trying to cut me off. I changed course, heading at an angle up the hillside, away from the logging road entirely. It was harder going, steep and rocky, but I had a better chance in rough terrain where I could see what was coming. I climbed for what felt like hours. My legs were burning, my lungs screaming, but I didn't stop. Finally, I crested a ridge and pulled out my satellite phone. 1 bar. Weak, but maybe enough. I hit All right, so listen up, because what I'm about to share is going to sound completely unhinged. And honestly, if someone had told me this story a year ago, I probably would have rolled my eyes and assumed they'd watched too many YouTube horror narrations. But this happened. It actually happened to me and 4 other people. I'm not claiming I understand what we saw or that I've figured it all out, but I need to tell this story before it drives me completely insane. Maybe somebody reading this has experienced something similar. Maybe you've been out in the Ozarks and witnessed things that defied explanation. I've gone over every detail 1,000 times, trying to make it make sense. This whole thing went down in early September 2023, but to really get why this messed me up so badly, I need to give you some context that goes back about 5 years. Back in 2018, I stumbled across this random online forum for people who were into backcountry camping. It wasn't anything official or organized, just a scattered group of folks across the Midwest who wanted to get out into wilderness areas, but didn't have regular hiking partners. You'd throw out a location, see who was interested, coordinate a meet, and head out. That's how I connected with Travis, Danny, Lisa, and Keith. Over the years, the 5 of us became a tight-knit group. We'd plan these extended camping trips throughout Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, basically anywhere with decent terrain and isolation. We bonded in that specific way you do when you're sharing meals cooked over a camp stove and dealing with each other's snoring. That kind of friendship doesn't come around often, especially once you're past 30. For years, we kept talking about exploring the deeper sections of the Ozark Mountains. It's this legendary area for anyone into primitive camping, but somehow it never worked out. Bad weather forecasts, scheduling conflicts, permit issues, you name it. But last September, we finally pulled it together. We mapped out a 6-day expedition through one of the more isolated regions, the kind of territory that doesn't show up in guidebooks or Instagram hashtags. This section was genuinely remote. Backcountry campsites spread miles apart, challenging elevation changes, thick forest coverage, exactly what we were looking for. We all converged at the trailhead on a Thursday morning. There was heavy fog rolling through, and you could see your breath even though it was early fall. Unusual weather for that time of year, but in the higher elevations of the Ozarks, you can get these random cold fronts that drop out of nowhere. We left our vehicles at this barely maintained dirt access road that looked more like an abandoned fire road and started our trek. That first day was incredible. Overcast but peaceful, autumn colors just starting to emerge, layers of fallen leaves cushioning every step. The kind of profound silence you only experience when you're genuinely far from civilization. We arrived at the first campsite around 7 p.m. as twilight started washing everything in purple light. It was one of those standard 3-sided lean-to structures, a bit weathered but functional. When we got there, someone was already set up, which caught us off guard, but wasn't completely bizarre. He appeared to be in his late 50s, hard-living type with this faded military jacket, an overgrown salt and pepper beard, and gear that looked like it had survived multiple decades. He introduced himself as Eugene, mentioned he was out there tracking something. When we asked what specifically, he gave this half-smile that didn't quite connect with his eyes and said, "Probably wouldn't mean anything to you folks." We chuckled and moved on. Figured he was just one of those characters who enjoyed being cryptic. None of us were particularly interested in hunting talk anyway, so we didn't press him. If he wanted to be enigmatic, that was his business. We prepared our dehydrated meals, shared some familiar stories from previous trips, and crashed as light rain began pattering against the shelter roof. Nothing heavy, just a steady drizzle, pretty standard for that region, and something we'd already factored into our plans. I remember waking up with unusual clarity that morning, mainly because I'd actually slept well, which was surprising. I wasn't in a real bed. I was compressed inside a sleeping bag, partially exposed to the elements, sharing space with 5 other people. Yet somehow, I felt genuinely rested. That was my initial thought when my eyes opened. But almost immediately, I noticed someone was already awake. Travis wasn't in his sleeping spot. I propped myself up and saw him outside the shelter, standing absolutely motionless, staring downward like he was trying to solve a puzzle. He must have sensed me watching, because he turned his head and gave me this quiet gesture, like, "You need to see this." Something in his expression told me it wasn't trivial. When I stepped outside and joined him at the shelter's edge, I understood why. The ground was covered in footprints, countless impressions, all bare feet. They were relatively small, maybe a child's size or a small woman's. But something was fundamentally wrong. The proportions were off. The toes were elongated, almost claw-like. There was no evidence of disturbance, no drag marks or signs of conflict. Just these unnaturally clean prints pressed deep into the damp soil, completely surrounding our shelter. We ended up rousing the others, hoping someone might have an explanation, maybe sleepwalking or something equally mundane. As improbable as it seemed, part of me desperately wanted it to be one of us. Anything to rationalize those prints. But everyone still had their socks on, completely dry. Their boots were wet, still covered in yesterday's mud, except for Eugene's. His boots were completely dry. That detail alone would have been suspicious enough, but his reaction made it stranger. While the rest of us stood there trying to process what we were looking at, Eugene showed almost no surprise. It was like he'd anticipated it. He glanced down at the prints briefly, and methodically started gathering his equipment. He told us he'd be continuing alone from here. We asked if he had any idea what had created those tracks. And from the way he responded, it was clear he knew exactly what made them. Said that was precisely why he'd come out here. Someone asked if it was some kind of wildlife, and he just brushed off the question. Then he mentioned something about these mountains, holding secrets older than any of us could imagine. Then he hoisted his pack and walked off in the direction the prince led. The rest of us just stood there exchanging confused looks, trying to comprehend what had just occurred. We decided it was best to keep moving as well, but in the opposite direction from both the footprints and Eugene. Nobody explicitly said it, but we were all thinking the same thing. We spent most of that day theorizing, trying to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was locals playing an elaborate prank. And yes, we even discussed the old folklore, tales we'd grown up hearing about strange entities inhabiting these mountains. By the time evening approached, we were drained both mentally and physically. We just wanted to forget about it. We told ourselves we'd put enough distance between us, and whatever that was, that it wouldn't repeat itself. And even though a few of us suggested cutting the trip short, we convinced ourselves it was probably just an elaborate joke and agreed to stick with our original plan, at least for one more night. But clearly, we were mistaken. And the situation didn't end there. Different campsite, identical phenomenon. It had rained moderately overnight. And when morning came, there they were, more of those disturbing barefoot impressions. This time, there were significantly more. We counted at least 13 distinct tracks, possibly more, like whoever or whatever was out there had been pacing circles around us throughout the entire night. That was the moment reality truly hit all of us. Something was genuinely wrong in these woods. And whatever it was, it had been dangerously close. Way too close. I've always been someone who sleeps like the dead, the type who could sleep through a thunderstorm without stirring. But Danny wakes up at the slightest disturbance. He kept obsessing over how there was absolutely no way something or someone could have been circling us without producing any sound. Not a single twig snap, not a leaf rustle. Even on wet ground, you'd expect some noise, but it was like they were hovering. 5 adults completely unconscious while those prints were being made just yards from where we slept. It was impossible. Nothing about it made sense. By the fifth night, everyone was on edge. We were physically depleted, emotionally exhausted, and the weather had deteriorated significantly. Freezing, unrelenting rain pounded the forest, saturating everything. The final campsite was more deteriorated than the previous ones, like nobody had maintained it in decades. We crowded inside, barely communicating. Something fundamental had shifted. The forest felt conscious. That's the only way I can describe it. That night, the weather had become genuinely brutal. So even though we were under a shelter, we secured a tarp across the opening to block the wind and precipitation. We also decided not to all sleep simultaneously, just as a precaution. We established a rotation. I was on watch around 5 a.m., sitting there in the darkness, knife within reach, mostly just listening to the storm assault the trees. And then I detected movement. I was peering through a narrow opening we'd maintained near the tarp, barely noticeable unless you knew exactly where to look. And through that gap, I saw them. They emerged from the forest edge like apparitions. 6 figures, humanoid, but fundamentally wrong, too diminutive. Not like children, but like adults who had never fully matured. Every aspect of them seemed distorted, gaunt, underdeveloped, almost skeletal. They were entirely unclothed and somehow completely unbothered by the temperature, just moving slowly, silently, circling the shelter like they were examining it. I was paralyzed, knife in hand, but completely frozen. I couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. I was terrified, obviously, but also strangely mesmerized. What was I actually witnessing? I reached over and nudged Danny's shoulder. He woke instantly like he'd been anticipating it. I gestured for absolute silence and shifted position so he could look through my vantage point. But as he repositioned, his jacket made the slightest rustling sound. And that was sufficient. The figures scattered, vanished back into the forest like startled deer. By the time he got a proper view, all he managed to see was their silhouettes disappearing into the darkness. They moved with impossible speed and silence, like the forest consumed them. We sat there in silence, the kind that feels dense and loaded with unspoken questions. I could feel his muscles tensing beside me, like the fear had physically manifested. When he finally whispered, he just asked what the hell those things were. I didn't have an answer. I was just grateful he'd witnessed them too, because if he hadn't, I would have spent the rest of my existence questioning my own sanity. They were moving in these fluid, circular patterns, not like they were hiding, but like they had infinite patience. Their limbs were disproportionately long, joints bending at slightly wrong angles, and they produced absolutely no sound. The ground was saturated mud, and they were barefoot, but not a single squelch or splash. It was like they had no mass whatsoever. Eventually, we woke the others to explain what had just transpired. Honestly, both of us felt absurd articulating it, but nobody questioned us. No one scoffed or challenged the story. I think subconsciously they'd all already accepted something was out there. And now 2 of us had direct visual confirmation. At least now we could connect a physical form to those footprints. I don't know if that made things better or worse, even though they didn't appear aggressive and hadn't actually harmed us. In fact, they'd fled the instant they detected our awareness. We still unanimously decided it was time to exit those mountains. We couldn't rationalize what we'd witnessed. Truth is, none of us had ever heard accounts of feral communities in the Ozarks. Sure, we'd heard vague rumors from other sections of remote wilderness, but never specifically in this region. And honestly, we weren't even certain if they were human. Yes, they resembled humans more than any other species, but simultaneously, their physiology was deeply abnormal. We submitted a formal report to the park rangers when we returned, documented everything. One of them took detailed notes, nodded thoughtfully. And when we pressed him for explanations, he just smiled slightly and said, "These mountains collect a lot of stories. Most of them never get resolved." But it wasn't the kind of smile that suggests disbelief. It was the kind that implies he's heard this narrative before, perhaps numerous times. And now I can't stop thinking about Eugene. That man knew something. I'm absolutely convinced of it. He came out there to track something, but refused to specify what. I don't believe he was hunting deer or elk. I think he was pursuing those entities. And honestly, that realization really disturbs me. What I'm about to share with you happened just 3 weeks ago. And even though I've faced my share of difficult situations over the years, nothing could have prepared me for how terrifying and life-altering this experience would turn out to be. My early years weren't exactly filled with warmth or stability. I grew up in a home where chaos was the norm, with a mother who struggled with addiction and mental health issues that she could never quite get under control, and a father who, when he was around at all, seemed more interested in escaping than being present. My mom wasn't a bad person, not at her core. When she was sober, she tried her best. She'd make promises about getting clean, about things getting better, and I wanted so desperately to believe her every single time. But those moments of clarity were always short-lived, swallowed up by the next relapse, the next breakdown. Still, I have to give her credit for one thing. Even in her worst moments, she never stopped telling me I could be more than our circumstances, that I could build a different life. And looking back now, I think those words, however inconsistently delivered, planted something inside me that refused to die, no matter how bad things got. By the time I was 16, my mom was in and out of rehab facilities. My dad had disappeared completely, and I was essentially raising myself, bouncing between relatives who didn't really want the responsibility and friends' couches when I could find them. School became impossible to focus on. How could I think about homework when I didn't know where I'd be sleeping that night? When I turned 19, my mom overdosed. It wasn't her first overdose, but it was her last. And as devastating as that was, as much as it tore something fundamental away from me, it also forced me to make a choice. I could keep drifting, keep being a victim of circumstances I didn't create, or I could fight like hell to build something different. So I started working. Any job I could get. Fast food, warehouse shifts, cleaning offices at night. I saved every penny I could. And after about 2 years of grinding, sleeping in shelters, and sometimes in my car when I could afford the insurance, I finally had enough to buy something that changed everything. An old conversion van from the 90s. It needed work, a lot of work. But it was mine. And it gave me something I'd never really had before. Independence. Real independence. It's been 8 years since then. And I won't lie and say it's been easy, or that I don't still have bad days when the weight of everything feels crushing. But I've learned to survive. More than that, I've learned to find moments of actual peace. The van life, despite all its challenges, has given me a kind of freedom I never thought possible. So now that you have that background, you'll understand why what happened feels like such a violation, not just of my physical safety, but of the life I'd worked so hard to build. I've always loved exploring remote areas. There's something healing about being surrounded by nature, away from the noise and judgment of cities. So when I managed to save up enough for 2 weeks off work, I decided to head up to the mountains of northern Idaho. I'd never been that far north before, and the idea of seeing those vast forests and untouched wilderness genuinely excited me. The van's not perfect. It burns oil, and the heater's temperamental, but I know every sound it makes. I know when something's wrong, and I was confident everything would run smoothly. The first 4 days were exactly what I needed. Cold, clear nights, stunning views, complete solitude. I did encounter a few odd things. One evening, I found a pile of what like discarded camping gear just dumped by the side of a forest road. Tents, sleeping bags, backpacks, all torn up and left there. It seemed strange, but I figured maybe it was from campers who'd had a bear encounter or something. I didn't think much of it, but everything shifted on the fifth night. I was parked on a dead-end logging road in Montana, just over the Idaho border. A beautiful spot near a small lake, surrounded by dense pine forest. I'd planned to stay there for a few days, do some hiking, and just disconnect completely. But things started going wrong almost immediately. I'd finished eating dinner and was inside the van, reading my headlamp, when I heard a vehicle approaching. That alone wasn't unusual. Occasionally you encounter other campers or hunters in these areas. But what made me pay attention was the speed. The vehicle was crawling, moving so slowly it was almost painful to listen to. And there was this weird rhythmic clicking sound coming from it, like something was dragging underneath. I peeked through the curtain, but couldn't see much through the trees. The vehicle seemed to stop somewhere up the road, maybe 100 yards away. Then the engine cut off. I figured they'd found their own spot and settled in for the night. But less than 5 minutes later, I heard footsteps. Not on the road, but in the woods, crunching through underbrush, snapping branches, moving slowly but deliberately, toward the van. My first instinct was to turn on my exterior lights, to make it clear someone was here. But something stopped me. Some primal survival instinct that said, stay dark, stay quiet, don't let them know for sure you're inside. The footsteps got closer. I could hear breathing now, heavy and labored. Then I heard a voice, low and muffled, like someone talking through cloth. Check the plates. Another voice responded, closer to the van. Already did. Utah. Long way from home. A third voice. This one sounded younger. Think anyone's inside? Silence. Then the first voice again. Doesn't matter. That's when I knew. These weren't curious campers. These weren't park rangers checking on me. These were people who'd done this before. People who knew what they were doing. I heard one of them try the door handle. I'd locked it, thank God. Then I heard what sounded like metal scraping against metal. They were trying to pry something. I grabbed the tire iron I keep under the driver's seat, the only weapon I had, and pressed myself against the back wall of the van. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. Then I heard the pop. Sharp and unmistakable. They'd slashed a tire. Then another pop. A second tire. I wanted to scream. I wanted to start the engine and try to drive away even on flat tires. But I knew that was exactly what they wanted. They wanted me to panic, to make noise, to confirm someone was inside. So I stayed frozen, barely breathing, as they circled the van. One of them tapped on the window with something metal. Tap, tap, tap. Casual, almost playful. We know you're in there. One of them sang out in a mocking tone. Might as well come out. Make it easier on yourself. I didn't move. Didn't make a sound. Then I heard something that gave me a sliver of hope. A distant engine. Getting louder. Coming down the road. The tapping stopped. I heard urgent whispers, then footsteps moving away from the van, back into the woods. The new vehicle, it sounded like a pickup truck, was getting closer. I made a split-second decision. This might be my only chance. I grabbed my phone and my keys, unlocked the back door as quietly as possible, and slipped out. The van was between me and where I'd heard the voices. I couldn't see them, and hopefully they couldn't see me. I ran toward the sound of the approaching truck, stumbling in the dark, branches whipping my face. I made it maybe 30 yards when I heard shouting behind me. They'd realized I was running. I heard crashing through the underbrush, someone giving chase. I ran harder, my lungs burning, my legs screaming. I could see headlights now through the trees. I burst out onto the logging road just as a pickup truck came around the bend. I waved my arms frantically, screaming for help. The truck slammed on its brakes. An older man jumped out, confused and alarmed. What the hell? I was gasping, barely able to speak. Men, in the woods. They were trying to break into my van. They slashed my tires. He looked past me into the darkness, then back at me. Get in the truck, now. I didn't need to be told twice. I jumped in and he threw it in reverse, backing down the road faster than seemed safe. There's a ranger station about 5 miles back, he said. We'll go there. You call 911. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone, but I managed to dial. The ranger station, when we got there, was small and only had one ranger on duty at that hour. But he took my statement seriously, radioed for backup, and within an hour we had local sheriff's deputies and Forest Service personnel. They went back to the logging road with me, but when we arrived, the van was still there. So were the slashed tires. But there was no sign of the men or the vehicle I'd heard. What they did find, though, sent chills down my spine. Scratch marks on the van's windows. And inside, they found something I hadn't noticed before. A small tracking device, magnetic, stuck underneath the rear bumper. Someone had tagged the van. Maybe that night, maybe days earlier. They'd been tracking me. The ranger told me this wasn't the first incident in the area. Over the past 3 years, there had been at least 6 reports of solo campers, mostly in vans or RVs, being harassed or attacked in remote locations. 2 of those incidents resulted in serious injuries. 1 person was never found. They think it might be the same group, people who target vulnerable individuals in isolated areas, knowing that help is far away, and that many van dwellers don't have permanent addresses or people who'd immediately notice if they went missing. They said I was lucky. Lucky the truck came when it did. Lucky I made the choice to run instead of hiding in the van. Lucky I wasn't somewhere even more remote. But I don't feel lucky. I feel violated. I feel like the one thing I'd built for myself, this mobile life that represented freedom and independence, has been poisoned. The van's still in Montana. I couldn't afford to fix it and drive it back. A friend drove out and helped me get my belongings, what little was left after I'd abandoned everything in my panic. I've been staying at a shelter while I figure out my next steps. And I'll be honest, I don't know what those steps are. Part of me wants to save up and get another van, to not let these people take this away from me. But another part, the part that still wakes up gasping in the middle of the night, reliving those footsteps and those voices, tells me I can't do this anymore. That some prices are too high to pay for freedom. I don't have answers yet, but I do know this. If you're someone who lives this lifestyle, who camps alone in remote areas, please be more careful than I was. Check your vehicle for tracking devices. Vary your routes. Let people know where you are. And trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't wait to find out.